The American networks removed entire episodes of this show before it ever reached your television. Not edited, not softened, removed. Because what was in them couldn't be made to fit what Saturday morning was allowed to be. What they cut out was a child carrying the weight of a war machine. Character deaths. Moral consequences. A detective who looked like a man who had seen too much. And a robot that wasn't a toy. It was a weapon, built during wartime, handed to a 10-year-old who wasn't supposed to question why. That version existed. It aired on the other side of the Pacific before a single frame reached the United States. And the gap between what Japanese audiences saw and what you got is larger than anything the theme song prepared you for. If suppressed TV history is your thing, subscribing means you get the next one the day it drops, not months later when the algorithm decides to show it. Here's the real story of Tetsujin 28 Go, and what they decided you didn't need to see. Gigantor. Act 1. What you thought you knew. Gigantor, the space-age robot, his power. What the show gave you was real, and it was genuinely good at what it did. That theme song was a declaration of intent all by itself. Gigantor, the space-age robot, he's at your command. Not a lullaby. A power fantasy delivered at full volume, and it worked. You held the remote. You were in charge of the biggest thing in the world. The show delivered on that premise with real consistency week after week. A villain appeared. Jimmy called in Gigantor. The robot dismantled the threat. Inspector Blooper nodded approvingly. Credits rolled. The whole operation was clean and efficient and satisfying in the way that only cartoons from that era knew how to be. The world had edges, and good always lived inside them. Inspector Blooper was central to that sense of safety. He was the adult in the room, bumbling just enough to be funny, reliable enough to be reassuring. He fit a well-established tradition in American children's entertainment, the benevolent authority figure whose primary function is to signal that everything's going to be fine. Every cheerful government agent, every good-natured older man in a 1960s kids show, Blooper belonged to that lineage, and he inhabited it comfortably.
Jimmy himself was the archetypal, capable young hero. Not conflicted, not overwhelmed. A kid who had been handed an extraordinary responsibility and carried it the way American children's television believed young heroes should. With confidence, determination, and almost no visible self-doubt. After the battles ended, he moved on. Next episode, he was ready again. That framing wasn't accidental. It was a construction, the result of deliberate creative and editorial choices made during the American adaptation of the series, shaped by a specific set of cultural priorities that governed children's broadcasting in the United States in the 1960s. The people who adapted this show knew their audience, knew their network standards, and knew exactly which elements of the original Japanese series needed to disappear before American families sat down together on a Saturday morning. Because the original series, Tetsujin 28 Go, created by manga artist Mitsuteru Yokoyama and first adapted for Japanese television in 1963, was built on fundamentally different assumptions about what a story could be and what a young audience could handle. The original was not a power fantasy. It was something closer to a moral reckoning. The robot at the center of the story wasn't simply a hero's tool. It was a weapon, a machine of mass destruction built under wartime urgency in a nation that had just come through the most catastrophic conflict in human history. In that context, the question of who controlled the machine and what it cost them was never a simple one. The original series took that question seriously in ways the American version never did. But before the 1960s American audience ever saw a single frame, that question had already been answered for them. The answer was Jimmy Sparks, grinning, remote in hand, ready for the next adventure. The boy in the original had a different name, and a very different face. Act 2, the original version. His name was Shotaro Kaneda. He was younger than Jimmy Sparks. smaller. And if you watched the original Japanese series, what you noticed most wasn't his confidence. It was the expression he wore after the battles were finished. Not victory, not relief. Something heavier than both.
How? How can they be safe? How? Because Gigantor will protect.
The boy after the battle.
Don't be scared, Reenie. Gosh, I can't understand what's happened to Inspector Blooper.
In the American version, Jimmy moves through a fight and comes out the other side essentially unchanged. The visual grammar of the character communicates certainty. He's a hero, and heroes don't second-guess what heroes have to do. Shotaro sat with it differently. After battles, after Tetsujin had done what Tetsujin was built to do, Shotaro was depicted with a pensive, troubled expression that the American version systematically removed. He grappled with it. He registered the ethical weight of having directed that much destructive force at another human being, even a villainous one. What that actually means is worth sitting with for a moment. This is a child who controls a machine capable of devastating a city block. In the American version, that power is a gift, clean, uncomplicated, exciting. In the original, it is a burden that lands on a 10-year-old's shoulders every single time the remote control is used. The difference between those two framings isn't cosmetic. It's the entire emotional core of the story.
Let's go, Gigantor! Let's go!
The man with the cigarette.
Yay! All units forward!
Now consider Inspector Blooper, or rather, consider who he was before he became Inspector Blooper. In the original Japanese series, the character's name was Inspector Shikishima, and in multiple episodes of the original, Shikishima was depicted doing something the American adaptation removed entirely. He smoked. That sounds like a minor detail. It isn't. A cigarette, in the visual language of mid-century storytelling, isn't about health advice. It's about imagery, about character. The detective with a cigarette between his fingers is a man who has seen things, a man carrying something unresolved, a man for whom the world is complicated enough that he needs a quiet moment alone with his own thoughts. That's not a children's cartoon trope. That's noir. That's a human being with a history behind him. When American broadcasters removed that element and replaced it with the affable, harmless Inspector Blooper, they didn't just cut a cigarette. They cut an entire emotional register. Shikishima's world weariness, his weight, the visual suggestion that fighting evil has a genuine human cost, all of it was softened into the agreeable comedic uncle who patted Jimmy on the head and said, "Good job."
Okay, we finally made it.
The father who was there.
For his next exciting adventure.
In the American version, Jimmy's father, Dr. Sparks, was a diminished presence, downplayed, sometimes barely acknowledged. The practical effect was that Jimmy appeared to operate almost independently, a self-sufficient young hero making his own decisions with the cheerful guidance of Inspector Blooper nearby. In the original, Shotaro's father, Dr. Kaneda, was something fundamentally different. He was present, actively involved. He sat with his son over schematics and walked him through the technical and moral architecture of what Tetsujin was and what it had been built for. His hand on Shotaro's shoulder wasn't a minor gesture. It carried the weight of legacy, of inherited responsibility, of a father trying to prepare his son for something too large for a child to hold alone. That relationship anchored the original's deeper themes in a way the American version simply couldn't replicate because it had removed the anchor. In the original, the robot isn't a cool machine. It's a family inheritance. It's connected to war and loss and the decisions of a father who is now doing everything he can to make sure his son understands the weight of what he's been given.
Gigantor and his friends, leaving New Guinea, heading for home.
What the narrator replaced.
Hey, he's coming right about. It must be a mistake.
No, I don't think so.
The original Tetsujin 28 Go trusted silence. It trusted the image. Scenes that required no explanation were allowed to simply exist. A figure standing at the end of an alley, a city glow on the horizon, a face with an expression that didn't resolve into anything easy. The audience was expected to do the work, to feel the weight of what was being shown rather than being told how to feel about it. The American version added a narrator. Here's how that narrator handled ambiguity. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Jimmy, the nefarious Dr. Demon's plan was already in motion, threatening the very foundations of the city.
That line isn't an exaggeration. It reflects the documented approach of the American adaptation, a narrator who stepped into every moment of complexity and explained it away, guided the audience, named the villain, resolved the tension, told you what was happening, what it meant, who was good, who was bad, and what you should feel about all of it before any of it had a chance to breathe. What you heard in the American version, a narrator explaining the threat, naming the villain, dissolving the tension before it could settle. What the original actually had, an image. A moment of genuine uncertainty, given room to exist on its own terms. That gap isn't a stylistic preference, it's a philosophy of storytelling. One version believed its audience needed to be guided through every uncertain moment. The other believed its audience was capable of sitting with something unresolved. Act 3. Why it was hidden. None of this happened by accident. The transformation of Tetsujin 28 Go into Gigantor wasn't a casual translation job. It was a deliberate and systematic editorial process driven by a very specific set of constraints that governed American children's broadcasting in the 1960s. The mechanism was network standards. American television networks in that era operated under strict guidelines for children's programming, and these weren't informal suggestions. They shaped every production decision. Violence had to be consequence-free or close to it. Character death, meaningful death, the kind that asks an audience to actually reckon with loss, was effectively prohibited. Moral ambiguity, the kind that leaves a viewer sitting with discomfort rather than resolution, was considered inappropriate for the Saturday morning slot. These weren't fringe decisions made by overzealous censors working alone somewhere. They reflected a coherent, if limiting, philosophy about childhood and what children should be allowed to experience through entertainment. The underlying belief was that children needed to be protected from complexity, from the possibility that good people could fail, that villains could have genuinely tragic dimensions, that the world might not resolve cleanly by the end of 22 minutes. The result, as documented by Anime News Network's encyclopedia entry on the series, was stark. The original version's moral weight and darkness were replaced by standard Saturday morning cartoon fare. Many episodes, specifically those with darker endings or character deaths, were simply not dubbed or aired in the United States. They were left on the floor entirely. That last fact is worth pausing on. This wasn't a case of elements being softened or reframed. Episodes were removed outright from the American broadcast run because their content couldn't be made to conform to what the networks required. Audiences watching Gigantor in the 1960s weren't just watching an edited version of the story. They were watching an incomplete one, with entire chapters of the narrative absent and unacknowledged. The name changes fit the same pattern. Shotaro Kaneda became Jimmy Sparks. Shikishima became Blooper. These weren't arbitrary choices. They were part of the process of making the show legible and comfortable to an American audience. Every element that felt too specifically Japanese, too morally weighted, too adult, identified and replaced with something that fit the American archetype. It's worth saying clearly, the people who made these decisions believed they were serving their audience well. They were broadcasters operating within a system that had clear rules, serving a commercial product to a specific market. The 1960s American Saturday morning cartoon slot wasn't designed for moral complexity. It was designed for breakfast cereal and wonder. By those metrics, Gigantor was a genuine success. But something specific was lost in the process. And the series that was lost, the original unfiltered Tetsujin 28 Go, contained something at its core that no American viewer of the 1960s ever received.
In there! They're all in there!
Act 4. The Anchor Revelation.
Hey, you a nut or something?
Here's what the American version never told you. In the original Tetsujin 28 Go, people died. Not in the abstract, bloodless way that action cartoons gesture at danger without real consequence. Characters died. Stories ended in grief. Villains who had been developed across multiple episodes met tragic ends rather than clean arrests. The moral logic of the original series operated on the understanding that this was a world with real stakes, real loss, and a real cost to the things that happened in it. That wasn't incidental to the series. It was foundational. Tetsujin 28 Go was created in a Japan that had emerged from World War II less than 2 decades earlier. Mitsuteru Yokoyama, the manga artist behind the original story, was writing in a culture that had lived through the specific horror of industrial warfare, of cities unmade, of technology deployed at a scale that defied imagination. The robot at the center of the story wasn't a fantasy artifact. It was a direct reflection of that history. A war machine, built in wartime, now in the hands of a child who was trying to figure out what to do with it. That context gave the character deaths their weight. That context gave Shotaro's pensive silences their meaning. That context gave Inspector Shikishima his cigarette and his worry lines. These weren't stylistic flourishes. They were the marks of a culture processing something enormous through the medium of a children's adventure story, using the form to do something the form wasn't usually asked to do. Every American viewer who watched Jimmy Sparks sail through his adventures untouched, untroubled, and perpetually ready for the next fight was watching a story that had been surgically separated from its own meaning. The victories were real.
The robot was genuinely impressive. The adventures were entertaining. None of that is untrue. But the reason those victories mattered, the weight behind the power, the cost embedded in the premise, the grief that made the heroism worth something, all of that was gone. What remained was a machine without its history, a boy without his doubt, a world from which all the losses had been quietly removed. The American version gave you Gigantor. The original gave you a story about what it actually costs to be the one holding the remote control when something that powerful does exactly what it was built to do. Those are not the same story. They were never the same story. So, here's where we land. The people who made these changes weren't trying to deceive anyone. They were following the rules of a system that had decided protection and care were the same thing. They looked at a story built around death and grief and moral complexity and the post-war legacy of industrial destruction, and they concluded that wasn't for you. Maybe they had a point. Maybe a 6-year-old eating cereal on a Saturday morning doesn't need a cartoon that wrestles with the human cost of wielding a weapon. But you're not 6 anymore. And knowing what was there, what was removed, what was decided on your behalf, what the original story was actually about, does it change how you hear that theme song now? Gigantor, the space-age robot, he's at your command. Which version hits harder for you? The one that protected you, or the one they decided you couldn't handle? Drop your answer below. I read every one.